If you're familiar with Middle-earth, you probably know that there's a lot of places that are sparsely or even completely uninhabited. For many of these places it makes sense. Some of them are uninhabited because they're so barren that they barely support life. Some are uninhabited because they're within an active war zone. Some places have been victims of catastrophic events in the past, such as wars, plagues, and natural disasters. But for some places it's rather surprising that they're uninhabited, because they're nice places, well protected, and not exactly remote. In this video, we look at the uninhabited western lands of Eriador. Between the arid Luin and the Hills of Evendim, you can find a strip of land that is notable for having the River Lune in its centre. You might have seen these lands called the Lune Lands or even New Eriador, but these are non-canon names. In fact, this land doesn't really have a name of its own, which is kind of surprising because it's not like this land wasn't important or that nothing ever happened here. In fact, this land is actually more important than you might think. For much of its history, the River Lune has been a border. We're not even sure the river existed in the First Age, but in the Second Age, it acted as an unofficial border within High King Gil-galad's kingdom in Lindon. On the west side of the river existed the actual kingdom of Lindon, but Gil-galad's influence went beyond the river, and all of the lands up until the Brandywine were technically part of his realm at the time. While most of his people dwelt west of the Lune and west of the Blue Mountains, many wandering companies of elves, mostly of Nandoran origin, did dwell east of the River Lune. The Lune ended up being incredibly important in the middle of the Second Age. During the War of the Elves and Sauron overran most of Eriador and had his sights set on destroying Gil-galad in Lindon. The Lune, defended by both elves and their allies, the Númenóreans, proved to be too difficult a barrier for Sauron to overcome. In the face of more and more Númenórean reinforcements, Sauron was pushed back from the river and eventually suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of the Gwathlo. The war was over, but so too was Gil-galad's influence over the lands east of the Lune. The lands around the Lune were now entirely empty for a time. The surviving elves had withdrawn to either Lindon or Rivendell because the lands in between had been ravaged by Sauron's armies. As for those native men of Eriador that had survived the conflict, they never actually lived beyond the Brandywine, as they had always been a little afraid of the elves. Although they did occasionally travel beyond the river, they never settled there. That said, the land did receive new arrivals shortly afterwards, and we're specifically told that many Númenórean colonists ended up dwelling in the lands around the Lune. This makes sense. The lands were empty, seemingly pleasant, and it was close to Lindon. By the end of the Second Age, there must have been a fairly large Númenórean population in the region because when Arnor was founded, Elendil chose Númenás as his capital city, not far from the River Lune. Although the Númenóreans had settled across much of Eriador, you might expect that Elendil envisioned the heartland of his new kingdom to be in the lands between the Lune and the North Downs. But this wasn't the case in the end. During the Third Age, as Arnor weakened, the Dunedain started to centralize more in the east as opposed to the west. Around the time Arnor split into Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, the capital city of Númenás was abandoned in favour of Fornost, and it seems that the lands around the Lune might have been abandoned as well. While there is no direct confirmation of this, we know that something similar happened to the Shire, which was also west of the Brandywine. Once well-tilled farmlands of the kingdom, the region was abandoned and became a royal hunting ground before it was eventually handed over to the migrating hobbits. It's rather strange that the lands around the Lune would be abandoned, though. They were far from evil and well protected by a number of natural barriers, mainly the Hills of Evendim. The land was probably reasonably fertile. After all, it wasn't too far from the Bountiful Shire and there was a major river running through it. The weather was also nicer there than it was in eastern Eriador. As ever, it was also very close to the lands of Lindon, where many elves remained, ruled by Círdan the Shipwright, and if one wished to deal with them, there was still dwarves dwelling in the western side of the Misty Mountains. I talked about it in my video on why Númenás might have been abandoned. One of the reasons I gave is that the Dunedain might have wished to be closer to the front to better conduct the war, and thus the capital and court of the king were removed to Fornost. Because of that, Númenás rapidly declined in importance, and as the number of Dunedain was diminished, the city could no longer truly be supported. With Númenás being abandoned, it's possible that the Dunedain who dwelt around the Lune wished to be closer to the heartland of their kingdom, possibly for either economic reasons or political reasons. Once they moved, there was no one left behind because the region was solely inhabited by the Númenóreans to begin with. Middlemen never really dwelt there. Regardless, the Loon would then play yet another important role in a war. When Angmar finally overran Arthedain, the surviving Arnorians fled across the River Loon into Lindon, although it doesn't seem like the Witch King attempted to cross after them. After Gondor's army arrived in the north, the host of the west, also consisting of the surviving Arnorians and the elves of Lindon, crossed back over the river to march on the Witch King at Fornost. Gondor's cavalry actually rode north up the valley and then did the long circle around the Hills of Evendim so that they could come down upon the Witch King's forces from the north. It was a huge success, the Witch King fled the field at Fornost and Angmar was soon destroyed. Even though Angmar was destroyed, Aranarth, who would have then been King of Arthedain, decided not to continue with the kingdom. Instead, he opted for the remaining Dunedain to become the Rangers of the North, a wandering people who silently protected those who remained in Eriador. The lands around the Loon might have made it for a great base, far from enemies, well protected, close to elven allies. But instead, the remaining Dunedain ended up making their villages in the Angle, in the far east of Eriador between the rivers Bruinen and the Mythythel. One possible reason for this is that Aranarth cared less for safety and more for the efficiency of the defense of the lands. In that case, it would make sense to have a base in the Troll Shores where danger was present and could be intercepted, as opposed to the lands of the Loon, which were far from danger. From this point on, the lands around the Loon seemingly remained empty. We are told that there was no Mannish settlement in Eriador further west of Bree, so that rules out any of them living there. Perhaps some might have jumped at the opportunity to live there, but perhaps they did not know the place, or perhaps there was some lingering doubt of living too close to the elves. Speaking of elves, if there were elven settlements on the western side of the river, they might have been abandoned as the elven population of Lindon declined. The only activity that would have occurred in the land was dwarven and elven travellers passing through, and perhaps the occasional man such as a ranger, a merchant, or an adventuring hobbit. While these lands probably were eventually resettled in the 4th Age, I think it would have taken quite a while. We're told that Aragorn rebuilt a house at Annúminas, but apart from that, there were no other populations of men to draw upon. It's far more likely that the eastern parts of Eriador, such as Minhiriath and Enedwaith beyond, and the lands around Fornost, were settled first, as these places were less remote and had some surviving scraps of civilization around them. Honestly, considering they were beginning to move westwards in the 4th Age, I wouldn't be surprised if hobbits ended up settling in those lands. In the end, it's kind of funny. While there was no shortage of empty lands in the Westlands by the end of the 3rd Age, at least most of those lands had several major red flags as to why settling them was not a good idea. On the other hand, the Loon lands seem to have been the perfect location for any searching settler. A nice place, a safe place, a place that would even be economically relevant thanks to a major river and traffic from the dwarves. But I guess these lands were just kind of forgotten. After all, how can you talk about a place if it doesn't have a true name? Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you have any empty places on the map, feel free to point them out and I'll see if they're worth a video. This isn't the first place I've spoken about. I also spoke about the Nameless Plains west of the Sea of Rune. As we've seen in that video, and in this one, just because a place is nameless doesn't mean that it wasn't important, and that it doesn't have a story to tell. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the River Loon literally just means Blue River, the least creative name in Middle-earth's history.